The silence in Montgomery County courthouse was so thick you could taste it, heavy with the weight of broken marriages and shattered dreams. Then my father's voice exploded like a bomb detonating in a library. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. You worthless parasite. Daniel Rothschild roared, his face purple with rage as he jabbed his finger toward my mother like he was casting a curse. 23 years I wasted on you. You think you deserve half of what I built with these hands? You'll crawl out of here with nothing. That's when I stood up. Every head in that courtroom turned toward me like I just announced I could fly. The leather chair creaked as I rose to my full height, my navy blazer straightening like armor clicking into place. Dad's mouth fell open. He'd been so busy destroying Mom that he'd forgotten I was even there. His trophy girlfriend Candace froze mid-smirk. Even Grandmother Delores stopped clutching her pearls long enough to stare. Your Honor, I said, my voice cutting through the toxic air like a sword through silk, may I approach? Judge Patricia Hawthorne's steel-gray eyes locked onto mine. This woman had a reputation for eating lawyers alive and spitting out their law degrees. She'd seen every trick, heard every lie, and had zero patience for courtroom drama. But something in my steady gaze made her lean forward with interest. Ms. Rebecca Chin Daniels, she said, recognizing me from my work exposing financial fraud across 3 counties. You may approach. I walked toward that bench like I was walking toward destiny itself. Each step echoed in the cathedral-quiet courtroom. In my briefcase was a manila envelope that had taken me 3 months of sleepless nights to build. 3 months of digging through records Dad thought he'd buried so deep that not even God could find them. The envelope felt warm in my hands, almost alive with the power of truth it contained. As I placed it on Judge Hawthorne's mahogany bench, the soft whisper of paper against wood sounded like thunder in my ears. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady as bedrock despite the hurricane in my chest, this documentation may help clarify some rather significant discrepancies in my father's financial statements. Dad's laugh was sharp and cruel, the same laugh he'd used when I was 10 and asked why Mommy cried in the bathroom. Oh, this should be good. My daughter thinks she can play detective now. What's next, Rebecca? Going to tell us about your imaginary evidence? But Judge Hawthorne wasn't laughing. She broke my wax seal with the precision of a surgeon, unfolding the papers like she was defusing a bomb. The entire courtroom held its breath. You could hear a pin drop, a heart break, a lie crumble. At first, her expression remained neutral, professional. Then something shifted. Her eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. She flipped to the second page, then the third, her reading pace slowing as the magnitude of what she was seeing began to sink in. That's when Judge Patricia Hawthorne did something that would become Montgomery County courthouse legend. She smiled. Not the tight, controlled expression judges usually wore, but a genuine, delighted grin that lit up her entire face. She looked at the bank statements, traced her finger down the highlighted transactions, studied the property deeds with their impossibly convenient timing. Then she did something even more remarkable. She started to chuckle, a sound that built into full-throated laughter that echoed off the courthouse walls like church bells announcing justice had finally arrived. Oh my goodness, she said, setting the papers down and fixing Dad with a look that could melt steel. Mr. Rothschild, this is absolutely incredible. The color drained from Dad's face like someone had pulled a plug. His confident smirk collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. Behind him, Candace's perfectly applied lipstick seemed to lose its shine, and Grandmother Delores clutched her purse so tight her knuckles went white. What's in there? Dad stammered, his commanding voice now nothing more than a whisper. I remained standing at that bench, watching 23 years of financial abuse and manipulation finally come home to roost. The man who had spent decades convincing everyone, including himself, that he was untouchable was about to discover that truth has very long fingers. Judge Hawthorne organized the papers with the careful attention of someone handling explosive evidence. Her smile never wavered as she announced, "Counsel, we'll take a 20-minute recess while I review these documents thoroughly. Please remain available." The gavel cracked like a gunshot, and justice had finally entered the building. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the courtroom erupted in whispered chaos, Dad spun toward me with eyes full of confusion and the first real fear I'd seen from him since I was a child, afraid of monsters under the bed. But now I knew the only monster had been sitting at the plaintiff's table all along. I didn't move from my position. I just stood there, watching the man who had spent decades teaching me that power meant crushing others finally learning that knowledge, real knowledge, was the ultimate power. And as the courtroom door swung shut behind the last observer, I whispered the words that had been burning in my throat for 3 months. You should never have underestimated the daughter you taught to read financial statements when she was 12, Dad. And you should never, ever have underestimated what happens when that daughter grows up to hunt people like you for a living. 3 years before that courtroom eruption, I was living what most people would call the American dream. Fresh out of graduate school with my master's in forensic accounting, I'd landed a position with Henderson and Associates, one of the most prestigious financial investigation firms in the state. My specialty was following money trails that corporate criminals thought they'd erased forever, and I was damn good at it. I'd grown up in Millbrook Heights, a picture-perfect suburb where every lawn was manicured and every family looked happy from the outside. Dad owned Rothschild Construction, a company he'd built from a single pickup truck into a multi-million-dollar empire that dominated commercial building contracts across 3 counties. Mom was the perfect executive wife, beautiful, charming, always immaculately dressed for charity galas and business dinners. From the outside, we were the family everyone envied. Dad drove a Mercedes, Mom had her BMW, and I'd graduated summa cum laude with scholarships that made the local newspaper. We lived in a sprawling colonial on Maple Ridge Drive with its circular driveway and perfectly pruned rose garden. Every Christmas, our house was featured in the neighborhood holiday tour. But money, I'd learned in my profession, always tells the real story. Dad hadn't always been a tyrant. When I was little, he was my hero, the man who taught me to ride a bike without training wheels, who showed me how to read blueprints and calculate square footage. He was proud when I excelled at math, bragging to his business partners about his little accountant, who could balance his checkbook by age 12. Numbers don't lie, Rebecca, he used to say, ruffling my hair as I helped him with paperwork in his home office. People lie, but numbers always tell the truth. He had no idea how prophetic those words would become. The change happened gradually, like a slow-acting poison. Success bred arrogance, and arrogance bred cruelty. The man who once celebrated my academic achievements began to see my intelligence as a threat rather than a source of pride. When I landed my first major case, exposing a construction company's bid rigging scheme, Dad's congratulations felt forced, his smile tight around the edges. Just remember where you came from, sweetheart, he'd said that night over dinner, cutting his steak with unnecessary violence. And remember who's been supporting you all these years. Mom had shifted uncomfortably in her chair, the same way she'd been shifting for months whenever Dad's voice took on that particular edge. I was so focused on building my career that I missed the signs, the way she flinched when he raised his voice, how she'd started apologizing for everything from overcooking the roast to forgetting to record a television show he wanted to watch. By the time I moved into my downtown apartment, Dad had transformed from my childhood hero into something else entirely. Success had curdled into entitlement. Pride had twisted into narcissism. The man who'd once taught me that numbers don't lie had apparently forgotten that lesson applied to his own life too. Mom, meanwhile, had been slowly disappearing. The vibrant woman who'd been active in 3 different charities and had once considered going back to school for her teaching degree had shrunk into someone who spent her days managing Dad's schedule and apologizing for existing. She'd given up her book club, stopped seeing her friends, and hadn't painted, her secret passion, in over 2 years. When I visited for Sunday dinners, I noticed how she'd wait for Dad to finish talking before she dared to speak. How she'd ask permission to buy groceries that cost more than $50. How she developed a nervous habit of checking her phone constantly, as if afraid she'd missed some important instruction from him. "Your mother's getting scattered," Dad would say with that condescending chuckle whenever she forgot something minor. "Good thing I'm here to keep her on track." But I knew scattered when I saw it. In my line of work, I'd interviewed enough victims of financial abuse to recognize the signs. The constant anxiety, the apologetic behavior, the way she'd second-guess every decision, even choosing what to wear or what to cook for dinner. The final straw came during my birthday dinner 18 months ago. Mom had made my favorite cake, chocolate with raspberry filling, and she was so proud, lighting the candles with shaking hands while Dad scrolled through his phone, ignoring the celebration entirely. "The frosting's a little lopsided," Mom said nervously, as if a crooked cake was some kind of moral failing. Dad looked up from his screen just long enough to grunt, "Looks fine. Though maybe next time follow the recipe instead of improvising." That's when I saw it, the light in Mom's eyes just dimming. Like someone had slowly turned down the brightness until there was almost nothing left. That night, alone in my apartment, I started wondering what other numbers in Dad's life might not add up. It wasn't suspicion exactly, more like the professional instinct that had made me so good at my job. When something feels wrong, you start looking for proof. I told myself I was being paranoid. Dad was successful, respected in the community, a pillar of the local business association. But my training had taught me that the most dangerous predators were often the ones who looked the most respectable on the surface. I started paying closer attention during family visits, watching the dynamics with the same analytical eye I used for fraud cases. I noticed how Dad controlled every conversation, every decision, every aspect of their shared life. I saw how Mom's credit cards had been replaced with ones that required his approval for purchases over a certain amount. How her name had been quietly removed from accounts she'd once managed. Most telling of all, I realized that in 25 years of marriage, Mom had never once contradicted Dad in public. Not once. That wasn't love. That was control. By the time Dad announced he was filing for divorce, not to discuss it, not to work on their marriage, but simply to inform her that their marriage was over, I already suspected he'd been planning this for months, if not years. What I didn't know yet was just how deep his deception went, or how long he'd been preparing to leave Mom with nothing while he rode off into the sunset with his construction fortune and his 26-year-old girlfriend. But I was about to find out. Because if Dad had taught me anything valuable over the years, it was that numbers don't lie. And I was very, very good with numbers. The warning signs started appearing like cracks in a foundation, small at first, then spreading until the whole structure threatened to collapse. It began with something as innocuous as a credit card statement. I was visiting for what had become our increasingly strained monthly dinners when I saw Mom frantically searching through a stack of mail, her face pale with worry. "What's wrong?" I asked, setting down my coffee cup. "I can't find the visa statement," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Your father asked me to check something on it, but I can't remember where I put it." Dad's voice boomed from the living room. "Helen. Did you lose that statement again?" My mother, Helen Marie Rothschild, who had managed a medical office for 15 years before Dad convinced her she didn't need to work, flinched like she'd been slapped. "I'm looking for it, Daniel. I'm sure it's here somewhere." I watched this woman who had once coordinated complex surgical schedules now reduced to trembling over a piece of mail, and something cold settled in my stomach. This wasn't normal anxiety. This was fear. "Mom, when did you last see it?" "Yesterday, I think. Or maybe Monday." Her hands shook as she sorted through envelopes. "Everything gets so confusing now. I used to be so organized, but lately." She trailed off, that familiar look of self-doubt clouding her features. That's when I noticed something else. The mail was sorted into neat piles, but they weren't organized by Mom's old system of bills, personal correspondence, and junk mail. Instead, they were arranged by Dad's priority, his business mail on top, household bills in the middle, everything else relegated to a small stack labeled Helen's Things, in Dad's rigid handwriting. "Why don't you just call the credit card company for a duplicate?" I suggested. Mom's laugh was hollow. "Oh, honey, I can't do that. Your father handles all the financial calls now. He says the representatives know him, and it's more efficient." More efficient. That phrase stuck with me like a splinter under the skin. Over the following weeks, I started noticing other things during my visits. The way Mom had to ask permission to buy groceries that cost more than her weekly allowance. How she'd stopped receiving mail at the house. Dad had simplified things by having everything forwarded to his business address first. The gradual disappearance of her personal items. Her jewelry had been moved to a safe deposit box for security. Her art supplies had been donated to charity because she never used them anymore, and her car had been traded in for a more practical model that happened to have a GPS tracker Dad could monitor from his phone. But the moment I truly understood what was happening came during a casual conversation about Mom's old friend Janet, who had invited her to join a weekend book club retreat. "That sounds wonderful," I said, genuinely excited to see a spark of interest in Mom's eyes for the first time in months. "Well, I'd love to, but..." Mom's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "It costs $300 for the weekend, including the hotel, and I just don't think we can afford it right now." I nearly choked on my wine. Dad's construction company had just landed a $2 million contract to build a new shopping complex. Our family vacations used to cost 10 times that amount. "Mom, $300 isn't exactly breaking the bank." "I know, sweetheart, but your father says we need to be more careful with discretionary spending. He's been tracking every expense to make sure we're not being wasteful." That word, wasteful, sent another chill through me. I'd heard it in Dad's voice countless times over the past year, always applied to Mom's small pleasures. Her monthly hair appointment was wasteful. The organic groceries she preferred were wasteful. The charity donations she used to make were wasteful. Besides, Mom continued, wrapping her cardigan tighter around herself, "He's probably right. I haven't been very good with money lately. Last month I accidentally bought the expensive olive oil instead of the store brand, and I didn't even realize until he pointed it out." She spoke about this mistake like it was a criminal offense, not a $2 difference in grocery costs for a family with a 7-figure net worth. That night, I went home and did something I'd never thought I'd do. I started researching financial abuse. What I found made my professional expertise feel like a cruel joke. I spent my days tracking down criminals who stole millions from corporations, while my own father was systematically stealing my mother's autonomy, dignity, and financial security right under my nose. The pattern was textbook perfect. Isolation from support systems, check. Complete control over financial resources, check. Gaslighting about her competence and memory, double check. Creating dependency through manufactured helplessness, triple check. Dad had spent 3 years slowly, methodically erasing my mother's ability to function independently. He'd convinced her she was forgetful, irresponsible, and incapable of making sound decisions. He'd positioned himself as her benevolent protector while systematically dismantling every aspect of her autonomy. And he'd done it so gradually, so carefully, that even I, someone trained to spot financial manipulation, had initially dismissed the changes as normal marital adjustments. The next time I visited, I paid attention with the same forensic eye I used for corporate investigations. I noticed that Mom no longer had access to their joint checking account. She had a debit card with a daily spending limit that Dad could monitor in real time. Her name had been quietly removed from the investment accounts she'd helped build during her working years. The house deed, which had once listed both their names, now showed only Dad's. When I casually asked Mom about their retirement planning, she looked genuinely confused. "Oh, honey, I don't really understand all that financial stuff. Your father handles all of that now. He says it's too complicated for me to worry about." This from a woman who had once managed payroll for a 30-person medical practice. But the moment that crystallized everything, the moment I knew I was watching a crime in slow motion, came when I arrived early for dinner one evening and found Mom crying quietly at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of papers. "What's wrong?" She looked up with red-rimmed eyes and tried to smile. "Oh, nothing serious. Just some insurance paperwork I messed up. Again." She gestured helplessly at the forms. "I used to be able to handle these things, but now everything just seems so confusing. Your father's right, I really should leave the important stuff to him." I picked up the papers. They were life insurance documents, and Mom's signature was required to increase Dad's beneficiary amount while decreasing her own coverage. The forms were deliberately complex, written in legal jargon designed to confuse, but the bottom line was clear: if something happened to either of them, Dad would get everything, while Mom would be left with barely enough to cover burial expenses. Mom, do you understand what these papers actually say? She shook her head miserably. Not really. But Daniel explained that it's just updating our coverage to be more, what was the word, equitable based on our current contributions to the household. Equitable. The word tasted like poison in my mouth. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't just going to watch my mother disappear piece by piece into Dad's carefully constructed web of control. I was going to use every skill I'd learned hunting financial predators to save her from becoming their victim. But first, I needed to understand exactly how deep the deception went. And that meant doing something that went against every professional and personal boundary I'd ever maintained. I was going to investigate my own father. Because if Dad thought he could gaslight a forensic accountant's mother into signing away her life, he was about to learn that some apple trees grow daughters who know exactly how to bite back. The breaking point came on a Tuesday that started like any other, until it didn't. I was reviewing a particularly complex embezzlement case at my office when my phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "Can you come over? Something important to discuss." The message itself wasn't alarming. Mom had been reaching out more frequently lately, usually for help with technology or to ask my opinion on household decisions she used to make without a second thought. But something about the formal tone made my stomach clench with unease. I found her sitting at the kitchen table, the same spot where she'd been crying over those insurance papers just 2 weeks earlier. This time, though, she wasn't crying. She was sitting unnaturally straight, her hands folded in her lap like a schoolchild waiting to recite a lesson. On the table in front of her was a single sheet of paper and a pen. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, her voice artificially bright. "Thank you for coming so quickly." "What's going on, Mom?" She gestured to the paper with a mechanical smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Your father thinks it would be best if I signed this. It's just some paperwork to simplify our finances." I picked up the document, and the words hit me like a physical blow. It was a quitclaim deed, a legal document that would transfer Mom's ownership interest in our family home entirely to Dad. The house she'd helped design, the garden she'd planted with her own hands, the place where she'd raised me for 28 years, all of it would become his sole property with the stroke of a pen. "Mom, do you understand what this is?" "Of course," she said quickly, though her eyes darted away from mine. "It's just paperwork. Daniel explained that it will make things easier for taxes and estate planning. You know how complicated these things can get." But her hands were shaking, betraying the confidence in her voice. "Where is Dad now?" "He had to run to the office, but he said if I could get this signed and notarized today, it would save us both a lot of trouble later." The manipulation was so brazen it took my breath away. Dad had deliberately left her alone with this document, knowing she'd be too intimidated to refuse but too confused to understand what she was actually signing away. He was counting on her learned helplessness, her conditioned fear of disappointing him. "Mom, this document would give Dad complete ownership of the house. You'd have no legal claim to it anymore." Her face went pale. But Daniel said it was just for paperwork purposes. He said it wouldn't actually change anything, just make the legal side cleaner. I sat down beside her, fighting to keep my voice calm even as fury burned through my veins. "Has he explained what would happen if you two divorced?" The question hung in the air like a grenade with its pin pulled. Mom's mechanical smile finally cracked, revealing the terror she'd been hiding underneath. "Divorced?" she whispered. "Why would you? We're not. Daniel would never." But even as she said it, I could see the pieces clicking together in her mind. The separate bank accounts. The removed names from documents. The systematic isolation from friends and financial independence. The 26-year-old marketing consultant who'd been spending an awful lot of time at Dad's office lately. "Oh God," she breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh God, Rebecca. What if he's planning to?" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. We both knew what Dad was planning. This wasn't about tax efficiency or estate planning. This was about ensuring that when he finally pulled the trigger on ending their marriage, Mom would be left with nothing but the clothes on her back and whatever scraps of spousal support a court might grant a woman with no assets and no independent income. Mom, listen to me very carefully. Do not sign this paper. Do you hear me? Under no circumstances should you sign this. But Daniel will be so angry if I don't. He's been planning this all week. He even made an appointment with the notary for this afternoon. The fear in her voice broke my heart and ignited my professional instincts simultaneously. Dad hadn't just been financially abusing her, he'd been training her to participate in her own destruction. Let me ask you something, I said, pulling out my phone. When was the last time you made a decision about this house without Dad's input? Mom stared at the quitclaim deed as if it were a snake that might bite her. I don't remember. It's been his house really, hasn't it? He pays the mortgage, he handles the maintenance, he makes the decisions about renovations. Mom, your name is on the original deed. You helped design this house. You chose the paint colors, the flooring, the landscaping. You've been making mortgage payments from joint accounts for 23 years. This isn't his house, it's your house too. For the first time in months, I saw a flicker of the woman my mother used to be. The woman who'd once stood up to a contractor who tried to overcharge her. The woman who'd negotiated my college scholarship package with the financial aid office. The woman who'd taught me that being polite didn't mean being a pushover. You're right, she said slowly, as if testing the words. You're absolutely right. That's when we heard Dad's Mercedes pulling into the driveway. The sound of that engine, a sound that had once meant safety and homecoming, now made both of us freeze like deer caught in headlights. Mom's brief moment of clarity evaporated, replaced by the familiar look of anxiety that had become her default expression. He's going to want to know why it's not signed, she whispered. Then we'll tell him the truth. That you've decided to think about it more before making such an important decision. Rebecca, you don't understand. When Daniel has his mind set on something, he doesn't like delays. He'll say I'm being difficult, that I'm overthinking things because I don't understand business. The front door opened, and Dad's voice echoed through the house with the casual confidence of a man who believed he controlled everything in his domain. Helen? Did you get that paperwork taken care of? Mom looked at me with eyes full of panic, and I realized this was it, the moment that would determine whether she remained trapped in Dad's carefully constructed web or began the long journey back to herself. I reached over and covered her trembling hand with mine. Mom, 23 years ago, you married a man who promised to love and cherish you. Today, that same man is asking you to sign away your legal right to the home you've built together. Which version of him do you want to listen to? Dad's footsteps approached the kitchen, each one counting down to a confrontation that would change everything. Helen? Where's that paperwork? Mom looked at the quitclaim deed one last time, then slowly, deliberately, picked it up and tore it in half. I've decided I need more time to think about it, Daniel, she called out, her voice stronger than I'd heard it in years. The footsteps stopped. And in that moment of silence, I knew the war for my mother's freedom had officially begun. The silence that followed Mom's declaration felt like the moment before a dam bursts. Dad's footsteps resumed, slower now, more deliberate. When he appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face wore the carefully controlled expression I'd learned to fear as a child, the calm before the storm. What do you mean, you need more time? His voice was perfectly level, which somehow made it more menacing than if he'd been shouting. Helen, we discussed this. The appointment with the notary is in 2 hours. Mom's newfound courage flickered like a candle in the wind, but she held on to it. I know, Daniel, but I've been thinking. Thinking? Dad's laugh was sharp. Since when do you think about legal documents? That's why I handle these things, remember? Because you get confused and make mistakes. I watched my mother's shoulders start to curl inward, her body responding to years of conditioning even as her mind fought to stay strong. This was how it always worked. Dad would use her manufactured insecurities against her until she capitulated. Not today. Actually, Dad, I said, standing up slowly, I've been looking at this document, and Mom has every right to take time with such an important decision. His gaze shifted to me, and for a moment, I saw something flicker across his face, surprise, maybe even respect, before it hardened into irritation. "Rebecca, this is between your mother and me. Adult business." Adult business like transferring sole ownership of a marital asset without proper legal counsel? The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Dad's jaw tightened, and I recognized the expression from countless business negotiations I'd witnessed as a child. He was calculating, trying to determine how much I actually knew and how much I was bluffing. "I'm trying to protect our family's interests," he said carefully. "This house represents a significant asset, and having clean title makes everything simpler for estate planning." Simpler for whom? Mom looked back and forth between us like she was watching a tennis match, her torn quitclaim deeds still clutched in her hands like evidence of a crime. Dad took a step into the kitchen, his presence suddenly filling the space in a way that made both Mom and me instinctively step back. "Rebecca, I understand you think you're helping, but you don't have all the information. Your mother and I have discussed this thoroughly." "Really? Then why don't you explain to both of us exactly how removing Mom's name from the house deed benefits her?" "Because," Dad started, then stopped himself. I could see him recalibrating, choosing his words more carefully. "Because your mother doesn't need the stress of property management. She's been struggling lately with paperwork and financial details. This way, she doesn't have to worry about any of it." The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost admired the technique even as it made me sick. He'd positioned his theft as protection, his control as care. "Mom," I said, turning to face her directly, "do you remember when you handled the entire refinancing of this house 3 years ago? When Dad was too busy with the Morrison project to deal with the bank?" I watched recognition dawn in her eyes. Yes, I do remember that. I negotiated a better interest rate than what they initially offered." "And do you remember managing the rental property on Oak Street for 5 years? Collecting rent, coordinating repairs, handling tax documentation?" Yes, I did handle all of that." Her voice grew stronger with each memory. "I was good at it too." Dad's control was slipping, and he knew it. That was different. Things were simpler then. "Helen, you know you've been having trouble keeping track of things lately. Just last week you forgot to pay the electric bill." "Because you changed the auto-pay without telling me," Mom said quietly, but with growing conviction. "I spent an hour on the phone with the electric company trying to figure out why the payment didn't go through." I felt a surge of pride watching my mother piece together the pattern of manipulation. But Dad wasn't finished. "Helen, sweetheart," he said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone that had become his default when addressing her, "I know Rebecca means well, but she doesn't understand our situation. She doesn't live here. She doesn't see the daily struggles." The word struggles hung in the air like an accusation. He was painting her as incompetent, and doing it in front of me to reinforce the narrative he'd spent years building. "What struggles, exactly?" I asked. Dad's smile was thin. "Your mother's been under a lot of stress lately. She's been forgetful, emotional. The doctor thinks it might be early onset anxiety, possibly even depression. It's been very difficult for both of us." I felt my blood turn to ice. This was new territory. Dad was now claiming Mom had mental health issues that affected her competency. If he could establish that narrative legally, it would give him grounds to control not just their finances, but every aspect of her life. "What doctor?" I asked. "Dr. Pemberton. Helen's been seeing him for a few months now." I looked at Mom, who seemed as surprised as I was. "Mom, have you been seeing a psychiatrist?" "Well, Daniel made an appointment for me with someone. I thought it was just a regular checkup, but the doctor asked a lot of questions about my memory and mood. He seemed very concerned about my stress levels." The pieces clicked together in my mind with sickening clarity. Dad had taken Mom to a psychiatrist, probably coached her responses about feeling overwhelmed and confused, and was now using that visit to establish a medical basis for her supposed incompetence. "Did you tell this doctor that you were feeling stressed about financial pressures at home?" I asked carefully. Yes, I mentioned that money matters were becoming more confusing for me. Of course she had. Because Dad had been systematically making them confusing, removing her access and then criticizing her for not understanding systems she was no longer allowed to participate in. Helen, Dad said, his voice taking on a wounded tone, I've been trying to protect you from exactly this kind of stress. This is why I didn't want to involve Rebecca in our private matters. But I wasn't backing down. In fact, I was just getting started. Dad, I have a question for you. If this deed transfer is really about protecting Mom and simplifying things, why didn't you suggest adding both your names to a living trust instead? That would provide the same estate planning benefits while maintaining both parties' ownership rights. Dad blinked, caught off guard by the specific legal knowledge. Well, that would be more complicated. Actually, it wouldn't. A living trust is the standard approach for married couples who want to simplify property transfer while protecting both spouses. Unless, of course, the goal isn't protection but control. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a neighbor's lawnmower. Dad stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of calculation and something that might have been respect, if it weren't tainted by anger. Rebecca, he said finally, I think you're overthinking this. Your mother and I have been married for 23 years. We've built a life together. I would never do anything to hurt her. Then prove it, I said. If this is really about estate planning and protection, let's all three of us sit down with an independent attorney who can explain the options and help Mom make an informed decision. Dad's face went very still. That's not necessary. Why not? Because I'm perfectly capable of handling our family's legal matters. But Mom's perfectly capable of understanding them when they're explained properly, right? I watched Dad realize he was trapped. If he agreed that Mom was competent, he couldn't justify taking unilateral control. If he insisted she wasn't competent, he'd have to explain why she'd been handling complex financial matters successfully for decades until he suddenly decided she couldn't. Mom, meanwhile, was watching this exchange with growing awareness. For the first time in months, I could see her beginning to understand that the confusion and helplessness she'd been feeling weren't signs of her own inadequacy, they were symptoms of someone else's manipulation. You know what? Mom said suddenly, her voice clear and strong. I think Rebecca's right. I think we should talk to an attorney. Together. Before I sign anything. Dad's mask slipped completely for just a moment, and in that instant, I saw him for exactly what he was, a predator who'd been caught in the act. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. If that's what you both want, we'll make an appointment. But I hope you're prepared for what you might learn about our financial situation, Helen. It's more precarious than you realize. And with that threat hanging in the air, he turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving Mom and me alone with the torn pieces of a document that had nearly signed away her future. I had a feeling Dad's version of their precarious financial situation was going to be very different from reality. And I was about to find out just how deep his deception really went. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. This wasn't about corporate fraud anymore, this was personal, and it required the kind of focused attention I usually reserved for my most complex cases. I started where I always started, with the paper trail. Mom had given me access to what financial documents she could find, though it quickly became clear that Dad had been systematically removing her from most accounts over the past 2 years. What she did have painted a troubling picture of gradual financial isolation, but I needed more than troubling, I needed evidence that would hold up in court. My first stop was Millbrook Community Bank, where my parents had maintained their primary checking account for over 15 years. I'd banked there since college, and the manager, Patricia Wong, knew our family well enough to greet me by name when I walked through the doors. Rebecca. How nice to see you. How are your parents doing? Actually, Patricia, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. I have some concerns about my mother's financial security, and I'm hoping you might be able to help me understand some account changes that have been made recently. Patricia's professional smile faltered slightly. In the banking world, family financial disputes were delicate territory, fraught with privacy laws and potential liability issues. Of course, I'd love to help, but you understand I can only discuss accounts where you're specifically authorized. I understand completely. My mother is prepared to sign authorization forms for me to review her account history. She's concerned that there may have been some changes made without her full understanding. That afternoon, I returned with Mom in tow and the necessary paperwork. What Patricia showed us made my stomach sink and my professional anger flare in equal measure. Over the past 18 months, Dad had systematically restructured their financial relationship. The joint checking account that had once required both signatures for major transactions now listed only Dad as the primary account holder, with Mom relegated to authorized user status, essentially giving her the financial standing of a teenager with a parent-supervised debit card. More damning was the pattern of transfers. Large sums, sometimes $5,000 or $10,000 at a time, had been moved from their joint savings into accounts that weren't visible on Mom's statements. When I asked Patricia about these transfers, her discomfort was obvious. Those would be going to accounts where Mrs. Rothschild isn't listed as an account holder, she said carefully. I can confirm the transfers happened, but I can't provide details about the receiving accounts without proper authorization from all account holders. How many accounts are we talking about? Patricia checked her computer screen, and I watched her eyebrows rise. It appears Mr. Rothschild has opened, let me count, 7 new accounts in the past 2 years. Business accounts, investment accounts, and what appears to be a personal savings account. 7 accounts. 7 financial hiding places that Mom knew nothing about. Patricia, I said, keeping my voice professionally calm, in your experience, is it normal for one spouse to open multiple accounts without the other spouse's knowledge? She shifted uncomfortably. Well, it's not unheard of, especially in business families where there might be complex financial needs. But these aren't business accounts exclusively, are they? No, she admitted. Some appear to be personal in nature. I made detailed notes of every account number, transfer date, and balance that Patricia could legally share with us. The pattern was becoming clear. Dad had been systematically moving assets out of joint accounts and into accounts where Mom had no visibility or access. Our next stop was the offices of Henderson, Murphy and Associates, the accounting firm that had been handling Dad's business taxes for the past decade. I'd done some consulting work for them in the past, which gave me enough professional credibility to get a meeting with senior partner James Murphy. Rebecca, good to see you. How can we help? Mr. Murphy, I'm here in a somewhat delicate capacity. I have concerns that my father may be manipulating financial documents in preparation for a potential divorce, and I'm hoping you can help me understand the tax implications of some recent business transactions. Murphy's face went carefully neutral, the expression of a man who'd seen this particular drama play out before. I see. And what specifically are you concerned about? I pulled out the bank transfer records Patricia had provided. These business account transfers, they're being categorized as consulting fees and operational expenses. But the timing and amount suggest they might actually be personal asset transfers disguised as business expenses. Murphy studied the documents with the careful attention of someone who understood that he was potentially looking at tax fraud. These are substantial amounts. And the categorization is indeed unusual. Could you help me understand what legitimate business purpose these transfers might serve? Well, Murphy said slowly, without seeing the supporting documentation, invoices, contracts, work product, it would be difficult to justify these as ordinary business expenses. And if they're not legitimate business expenses? Then they would constitute personal use of business funds, which has significant tax implications. And if they were done with intent to hide marital assets? He trailed off, but the implication was clear. Mr. Murphy, I need to ask you directly, has my father requested any unusual tax strategies or business restructuring advice in the past year? Murphy was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with client confidentiality obligations. Finally, he said, I can't discuss specific client communications, but I will say that we've had several conversations about asset protection strategies that I found ethically questionable. I advised against some of the approaches he was considering. The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Dad wasn't just planning to divorce Mom, he was planning to leave her financially devastated while protecting his own assets through a combination of business manipulation and outright fraud. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with 3 legal pads full of notes, trying to organize the evidence I'd gathered into a coherent picture. The scope of Dad's deception was breathtaking: hidden accounts, manipulated business expenses, isolated financial access, and what appeared to be a systematic plan to claim Mom was mentally incompetent to manage her own affairs. But I was missing something crucial: direct evidence of intent. Everything I'd found so far could potentially be explained away as legitimate business practices or marital financial management, however unethical. I needed something that clearly demonstrated Dad's deliberate plan to defraud Mom. That's when I remembered something that had been nagging at me since our confrontation in the kitchen. Dad's reference to Dr. Pemberton and Mom's supposed mental health issues had felt too convenient, too well-timed. Mental health records could be powerful evidence in divorce proceedings, especially if they supported claims of incompetence or inability to manage financial affairs. I called Mom that evening. "I need to ask you some specific questions about your visit with Dr. Pemberton. Do you remember exactly what Dad told you about why you needed to see him?" "He said I'd been under a lot of stress and that it would be good for me to talk to someone professional. He said Dr. Pemberton specialized in helping women my age who were having trouble adjusting to life changes." "Life changes?" "You know, empty nest syndrome, aging parents, hormonal changes." Daniel said it was very common for women to struggle with these transitions. I felt my jaw clench. Dad had taken Mom to a psychiatrist under false pretenses, coached her to discuss symptoms that would support his narrative of her declining competence, and was now using those sessions as evidence of her inability to manage her own affairs. "Mom, do you remember signing any forms during that visit? Anything about releasing medical information?" "Oh yes, there were several forms. Daniel helped me fill them out since some of the medical terminology was confusing." Of course he had. Dad had probably authorized himself to receive copies of Mom's medical records, giving him access to professional documentation of her mental health struggles he'd created through his own manipulation and abuse. The next morning, I made one more call that would change everything. I contacted Sarah Chen, a family law attorney I'd worked with on several financial fraud cases. Sarah had a reputation for being brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely unforgiving when it came to financial abuse in divorce proceedings. "Sarah, I need your help. Not for a client, for my family. I think my father is planning to financially destroy my mother in a divorce, and I have evidence." "How much evidence?" "Enough to bury him. But I need someone who knows how to present it properly." Sarah's voice took on the sharp edge I'd heard her use in depositions. "Can you be here in an hour? And Rebecca? Bring everything. Every document, every bank record, every scrap of paper you've found. If your father thinks he can commit financial fraud and get away with it, he's about to learn why that's a very bad idea." As I gathered my evidence files, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this nightmare began: hope. Dad had spent years teaching me that numbers don't lie. He was about to discover that his own daughter had become very, very good at making numbers tell the truth. And the truth was going to cost him everything. 3 days later, I made a decision that crossed every professional and ethical line I'd ever maintained. I was going to break into Dad's home office. Not break in, exactly. I still had my key to the house, and Dad would be at his weekly Rotary Club meeting until at least 9 o'clock. Mom was visiting her sister in Phoenix for the week, a trip Dad had suddenly encouraged after our kitchen confrontation, claiming she needed time to clear her head. What he really wanted was her out of the way while he accelerated whatever timeline he was working toward. Sarah Chen had been brutally honest during our meeting. "The evidence you've gathered is compelling, but it's all circumstantial. We can demonstrate a pattern of financial control and manipulation, but proving intent to defraud requires something more concrete. We need documentation of his actual plan, emails, written communications, something that shows deliberate premeditation." That something was waiting for me in Dad's locked filing cabinet, behind the bookshelf in his home office. I'd seen him access it countless times growing up, always with the casual confidence of a man who believed his secrets were safe from prying eyes. The house felt different without Mom's presence, colder, more austere. Dad had already begun removing her personal touches, I noticed. The family photos on the hallway tables had been replaced with generic landscape prints. Mom's reading chair in the living room was gone, along with the small bookshelf where she kept her romance novels and gardening magazines. He was erasing her from their shared life one piece at a time, preparing the house for its new occupant. Dad's office smelled of expensive cologne and leather, the scent of a man who'd built his identity around the trappings of success. His desk was immaculate as always, every pen in its designated holder, every document filed with military precision. But it was the filing cabinet that drew my attention, for drawers of locked secrets that might hold the key to saving my mother's future. I'd learned the combination years ago, back in high school when I'd helped Dad organize his tax documents. He'd never changed it, 0847, Mom's birthday. The irony wasn't lost on me that he'd used the birth date of the woman he was planning to betray as the key to protecting his secrets. The first drawer contained routine business documents, contracts, invoices, correspondence with suppliers. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested anything beyond normal business operations. The second drawer held tax records and financial statements, all of which appeared legitimate at first glance. But the third drawer was different. Inside, I found a manila folder labeled contingency planning, a euphemism so bland it was almost insulting. Inside that folder was a roadmap for the systematic destruction of my mother's financial security, laid out with the same methodical precision Dad brought to his construction projects. The first document was a handwritten timeline in Dad's distinctive script. At the top, he'd written Project Reset and dated it 18 months earlier, right around the time Mom had started showing signs of the anxiety and confusion that Dad had been attributing to her declining mental state. The timeline was chilling in its calculated cruelty. Phase 1, establish separate business accounts and redirect income streams. Transfer joint assets to business entities. Document Helen's confusion about financial matters. Phase 2, reduce Helen's access to accounts. Implement spending controls. Begin medical documentation of stress/anxiety issues. Phase 3, remove Helen from property deeds and investment accounts. Establish her legal incompetence through medical records. Phase 4, file for divorce. Claim minimal marital assets due to Helen's lack of contribution and inability to manage finances. Each phase had been meticulously executed, with checkmarks next to completed items and notes about timing and strategy. This wasn't the impulsive decision of a man who'd fallen out of love. This was a long-term campaign designed to impoverish his wife while maximizing his own financial gain. But that wasn't the worst of it. The second document in the folder was a series of email printouts between Dad and someone identified only as CM. Based on the intimate tone and references to their future together, I realized I was reading correspondence between Dad and Candace Morris, the marketing consultant who was apparently much more than just a business associate. One email, dated just 2 weeks earlier, made my blood run cold. Darling D, the timeline is perfect. Your lawyer says the psychiatric evaluations will be key to establishing H's incompetence. Once we have medical evidence of her mental instability, the court will have to consider a conservatorship arrangement. You'll get everything, and she'll have supervised care for the rest of her life. We can finally start our real life together. Can't wait to redecorate that dreary house. All my love, C. Dad's response was equally damning. C. Everything is proceeding exactly as planned. Dr. Pemberton has been very cooperative in documenting H's cognitive decline. The financial transfers are complete, and my attorney assures me that H will have no grounds for claiming significant marital assets. By Christmas, we'll be free to start fresh. You deserve so much more than these secretive meetings. Soon, you'll have everything you've ever wanted. D. I sat in Dad's leather chair, staring at these documents with a mixture of horror and professional admiration for the thoroughness of his planning. He hadn't just been hiding assets, he'd been building a legal case for having Mom declared mentally incompetent, which would allow him to control not just their divorce settlement but potentially the rest of her life. The third document was a financial summary that took my breath away. Dad had systematically transferred over $2.3 million in assets out of joint accounts and into business entities and investment vehicles that Mom knew nothing about. The family home, which was worth at least $800,000, would become his sole property through the quitclaim deed Mom had wisely refused to sign. Mom's retirement accounts had been emptied and reinvested in business ventures that existed only on paper. But the final document in the folder was the one that made me understand just how deep Dad's betrayal went. It was a copy of a new will, signed and notarized just 3 months earlier, that left everything to my beloved partner Candace Morris, and specifically disinherited my estranged wife Helen Rothschild, due to her diminished capacity and inability to manage financial affairs responsibly. He wasn't just planning to leave Mom with nothing in the divorce, he was planning to cut her out of his will entirely, using the same mental incompetence narrative he'd been building through Dr. Pemberton's evaluations. I photographed every document with my phone, making sure to capture not just the content but also Dad's handwritten notes and the dates on each page. This wasn't just evidence of financial fraud, this was documentation of a criminal conspiracy that involved multiple parties, including the psychiatrist who'd been helping Dad build his case for Mom's incompetence. As I carefully returned the documents to their folder and relocked the filing cabinet, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this nightmare began, the cold satisfaction of a predator who'd found her prey. Dad thought he'd been so clever, so thorough in his planning. He'd manipulated Mom's emotions, isolated her from support systems, and even corrupted medical professionals to support his narrative. But he'd made one critical mistake: he'd documented everything. In my world, the world of forensic accounting and financial investigation, we had a saying: the cover-up is always worse than the crime. Dad hadn't just committed financial fraud, he'd created a paper trail that proved premeditation, conspiracy, and intent to harm. Sarah Chen was going to have a field day with this evidence. But more importantly, Mom was finally going to understand that she wasn't losing her mind, wasn't incompetent, wasn't the problem in their marriage. She was the victim of a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to make her doubt her own sanity while her husband systematically stole her future. As I locked the house and walked to my car, I realized that Dad's timeline was about to change dramatically. He thought he had until Christmas to complete his Project Reset. What he didn't know was that his own daughter was about to reset everything, starting with making sure he faced the full consequences of his actions in a court of law. The hunter had just become the hunted, and Dad was about to learn that some prey bite back. The next morning, I sat across from Sarah Chen in her downtown office, watching her methodically review each photograph on my phone with the focused intensity of a surgeon examining X-rays. The evidence from Dad's filing cabinet was spread across her conference table in neat piles: financial records, email printouts, the damning timeline, and the fraudulent will. "Rebecca," Sarah said finally, setting down the last document, "in 20 years of practicing family law, I've never seen premeditation this thorough or this malicious. Your father didn't just plan to steal from your mother, he orchestrated a complete psychological campaign designed to make her believe she deserved it." I'd been hoping for validation, but hearing it stated so bluntly still hit me like a physical blow. What are our options? Legally? We have enough evidence to not only stop the divorce proceedings but to trigger criminal investigations for fraud, conspiracy, and potentially elder abuse. Sarah leaned back in her chair. But there's a problem. How are you planning to explain how you obtained this evidence? The question I'd been dreading. I used my key to enter the house while Dad was out. I didn't break anything, didn't steal anything, just photographed documents. That's still potentially a legal search and seizure. A good defense attorney could argue the evidence is inadmissible because it was obtained without consent. My stomach sank. So we can't use it? I didn't say that. But we need to be strategic about how we present it. The timeline and financial records might be challenged, but the emails between your father and his girlfriend are different. Those exist as digital communications that could be subpoenaed through legitimate channels once we establish probable cause. Sarah pulled out a legal pad and began sketching out a strategy. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to give your father exactly what he thinks he wants: a quick, quiet divorce where he maintains control of the narrative. But we're going to use his own arrogance against him. Over the next 2 hours, we crafted a plan that was as methodical as Dad's Project Reset, but designed to expose rather than conceal. The key was making Dad believe he was winning while we systematically documented every aspect of his fraud for the court record. The beauty of this approach, Sarah explained, is that we're going to let him present his narrative first. He'll claim your mother is incompetent, that he's been the sole financial provider, that their assets are minimal because of her poor decisions. He'll present Dr. Pemberton's evaluation and argue for a settlement that leaves your mother with minimal support. And then? Then we present the real financial picture. Every hidden account, every transferred asset, every fraudulent business expense. We'll show the court exactly how much money exists and where he's hidden it. The contrast between his claims and reality will be devastating. But first, we needed to protect Mom from Dad's accelerating timeline. Sarah drafted emergency motions for temporary restraining orders that would freeze all marital assets and prevent Dad from making any additional transfers or changes to accounts, insurance policies, or property ownership. We'll file these the same day your father files for divorce, Sarah said. He won't see it coming until it's too late. The hardest part was keeping everything secret from Mom. She'd returned from Phoenix looking more relaxed than I'd seen her in months, and I didn't want to destroy that peace with the horrifying details of Dad's betrayal. Instead, I focused on the practical steps we needed to take to protect her. Mom, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to trust me completely. We were sitting in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd almost signed away her rights to the house just weeks earlier. Now it felt like a war room where we were planning her liberation. Of course, sweetheart. What do you need? I need you to gather every financial document you can find, old tax returns, bank statements, investment records, insurance policies, anything with account numbers or financial information. Put them all in a box and bring them to my apartment. Is this about the attorney consultation Daniel agreed to? Partially. But Mom, I also need you to open your own checking account at a different bank. Put some money in it, not a lot, just enough for basic expenses for a few weeks. Mom's face clouded with worry. Rebecca, that sounds like I'm hiding money from your father. That doesn't seem right. Mom, listen to me carefully. You're not hiding money, you're protecting yourself. Dad has been making changes to your accounts without telling you. Having your own account ensures you can pay for groceries and gas no matter what else happens. I helped her open an account at First National, a different bank from where Dad conducted his business. We deposited $2,000, money from Mom's small inheritance from her mother that she'd kept in a separate savings account Dad had apparently overlooked in his asset transfer campaign. Over the following week, I worked with Sarah to prepare our counteroffensive while maintaining the facade of normalcy at home. Dad seemed pleased that Mom appeared to be adjusting better to their new financial arrangements. He even complimented her on being more reasonable about household expenses. If he'd been paying closer attention, he might have noticed that Mom was quietly photographing financial documents before returning them to his filing system. Or that she'd started keeping a detailed journal of their conversations about money, property, and their future plans. Or that she'd scheduled a second opinion appointment with a different psychiatrist, one who wasn't on Dad's payroll. Your father called Dr. Pemberton's office yesterday, Mom told me during one of our planning sessions. He wanted to schedule another evaluation session for me. He said it was important to have updated documentation of my progress. What did you tell him? That I'd prefer to wait until after we meet with the attorney. He seemed frustrated by that. Frustrated was putting it mildly. I'd noticed Dad's increasing agitation as his carefully planned timeline encountered unexpected delays. Mom's refusal to sign the quitclaim deed had forced him to explore other options for transferring the house, none of which were as clean or legally defensible as having her voluntary cooperation. More concerning, Candace had started making more frequent appearances at family events, as if Dad was testing the waters for introducing her as a permanent fixture in his life. At Sunday dinner the previous week, she'd made pointed comments about how nice it would be to have a fresh start in a house that reflected modern sensibilities rather than outdated decorating choices. Mom had smiled politely, but I'd seen her grip her coffee cup tighter with each passive-aggressive jab at her taste and choices. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening when Dad made a critical mistake. He'd been drinking more lately, the stress of managing his complex deception was apparently taking its toll, and alcohol had always made him careless with details. Helen, he announced over dinner, I've decided we should accelerate our timeline for getting our affairs in order. I'd like to have everything settled by Thanksgiving. That's only 6 weeks away, Daniel. Isn't that rather rushed? Not really. The sooner we clarify our financial situation, the better it will be for both of us. Besides, he added with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, Candace has been helping me understand how much simpler life could be with proper organization. Mom set down her fork carefully. What kind of organization? Well, for instance, this house is really too large for your needs now that Rebecca's moved out. Something smaller, more manageable, would be much more appropriate for a woman in your situation. The word situation hung in the air like a threat. Dad was no longer even pretending this was about mutual benefit or estate planning. He was preparing Mom for the reality that she would soon be living somewhere else, on someone else's terms, with someone else's money. That night, I called Sarah with an update. He's moving faster than we anticipated. I think he's planning to file within the next few weeks. Good, Sarah said. Let him. The sooner he shows his hand, the sooner we can show ours. Is your mother ready? I looked across my apartment at Mom, who was carefully organizing financial documents into the binders we'd prepared, her movements steady and purposeful. The confused, anxious woman of a few months ago had been replaced by someone who understood exactly what she was fighting for. She's ready, I said. More than ready. Then it's time to let your father discover that some prey fight back. The courtroom was exactly as I remembered from my vision that morning 3 weeks ago, but now I was living it in real time instead of imagining it. Dad sat at the plaintiff's table in his charcoal Armani suit, radiating the confidence of a man who believed he'd orchestrated every detail of the day's proceedings. His attorney, Kellerman, shuffled through papers with the satisfied efficiency of someone billing premium rates for what he assumed would be a straightforward asset grab. Candace sat in the gallery wearing cream-colored silk, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against her clutch as she waited to watch Dad's legal demolition of his wife. Grandmother Delores occupied her usual position of moral authority in the back row, her emerald brooch catching the morning light as she prepared to witness what she clearly believed was justice finally being served to a daughter-in-law she'd never deemed worthy of the family name. And then there was Mom, sitting beside Sarah Chin at the defendant's table, looking smaller than usual but with something different in her posture, a quiet steadiness that hadn't been there 3 months ago. She wore the navy suit I'd bought her for this day, her hands folded calmly in her lap, no longer trembling. Judge Hawthorne called the proceedings to order with the same no-nonsense efficiency that had made her reputation in Montgomery County. We're here today for Foster v. Rothschild, case number 2023, Dr. 4471. Mr. Kellerman, you may proceed with your opening statement. Kellerman rose with theatrical flair, adjusting his gold tie clip as he approached the bench. Your Honor, this is a straightforward case of a marriage that has unfortunately run its course. My client, Mr. Daniel Rothschild, has been the sole financial provider for this family for over 2 decades, building a successful construction business while supporting a wife who, sadly, has proven increasingly unable to manage even basic household responsibilities. I watched Dad nod solemnly, playing the role of the long-suffering husband with practiced ease. Mrs. Rothschild has no significant assets of her own, having chosen not to work outside the home for the past 15 years. She has contributed minimally to the marital estate and has, in recent years, shown concerning signs of financial irresponsibility and emotional instability that have made it impossible for my client to maintain a healthy marriage. Kellerman gestured toward a stack of documents on his table. We have medical documentation from Dr. Franklin Pemberton indicating that Mrs. Rothschild suffers from anxiety and depression that significantly impact her decision-making capabilities. We believe a modest spousal support arrangement and a small settlement will adequately provide for her needs while allowing Mr. Rothschild to maintain the business assets he has worked his entire life to build. The performance was flawless, compassionate concern mixed with reluctant necessity, painting Dad as the responsible party forced to make difficult decisions about a wife who had become more burden than partner. Given Mrs. Rothschild's limited capacity for financial management, we recommend that any support payments be administered through a third-party management service to ensure her basic needs are met without risk of financial mismanagement. Third-party management. They wanted to treat Mom like a child who couldn't be trusted with her own money. Judge Hawthorne made notes as Kellerman returned to his seat, then nodded toward our table. Ms. Chen, your opening statement. Sarah stood with the calm precision of a surgeon preparing to operate. Your Honor, this case represents one of the most calculated and malicious examples of financial abuse I have encountered in my career. What Mr. Kellerman has presented as a story of spousal support is actually a carefully orchestrated campaign of theft, fraud, and emotional manipulation designed to impoverish Mrs. Rothschild while enriching her husband and his mistress. Dad's confident expression flickered for the first time. Kellerman started to object, but Judge Hawthorne raised a hand. Ms. Chen, those are serious allegations. I trust you have evidence to support them. Your Honor, I have extensive documentation that will demonstrate how Mr. Rothschild systematically transferred over $2 million in marital assets to hidden accounts, forged his wife's signature on legal documents, conspired with a psychiatrist to create false medical records, and planned to have Mrs. Rothschild declared mentally incompetent so he could control not just their divorce settlement but potentially the rest of her life. The courtroom went completely silent. Candace stopped drumming her fingers. Grandmother Delores clutched her pearls. Even the court reporter paused her typing. Furthermore, Sarah continued, we have evidence that Mr. Rothschild has been conducting an affair with Ms. Candace Morris, who is present in the courtroom today, and that they have been planning to use the proceeds of this fraudulent divorce to finance their new life together. Dad shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. These are desperate accusations from a wife who can't accept that our marriage is over. Mr. Rothschild, sit down, Judge Hawthorne said sharply. You'll have your opportunity to respond. Ms. Chen, I assume you're prepared to present this evidence? Yes, Your Honor. We'd like to call our first witness. That's when I stood up. Every head in the courtroom turned toward me as I walked to the witness stand, my heels clicking against the marble floor with the same rhythm I'd imagined weeks ago. Dad's eyes followed my movement with growing confusion and what might have been the first flicker of genuine concern I'd seen from him all morning. After being sworn in, Sarah approached with a manila folder, the same folder that contained copies of everything I'd found in Dad's filing cabinet. Ms. Chen Daniels, would you please state your profession for the record? I'm a certified forensic accountant specializing in financial fraud investigation. I work for Henderson and Associates, and I've been qualified as an expert witness in financial crimes cases in this jurisdiction. And what is your relationship to the parties in this case? Daniel Rothschild is my father. Helen Rothschild is my mother. Judge Hawthorne leaned forward slightly. Ms. Chen Daniels, are you testifying on behalf of your mother? Yes, Your Honor. When I became aware that my mother might be the victim of financial fraud, I conducted an investigation using the same forensic accounting techniques I use in my professional work. Sarah opened the folder and handed me the first document. Can you identify this document? I looked at the paper, though I had every word memorized. This is a handwritten timeline found in my father's personal files, titled Project Reset and dated 18 months ago. It outlines a systematic plan to transfer marital assets, isolate my mother from financial resources, and establish her legal incompetence through fraudulent medical documentation. Dad's face had gone completely white. Kellerman was frantically whispering in his ear, but Dad seemed unable to process what he was hearing. Your Honor, Sarah said, we'd like to submit this timeline as Exhibit A, along with 47 supporting documents that detail the execution of this plan. Objection. Kellerman finally found his voice. We question the authenticity and the means by which these documents were obtained. Judge Hawthorne studied the timeline, her expression growing more serious with each line she read. Ms. Chen Daniels, how did you come to possess these documents? This was the moment Sarah and I had prepared for most carefully. Your Honor, as part of my investigation into potential financial crimes against my mother, I obtained access to documents that my father had claimed were family financial records. When I discovered evidence of fraud, I documented it according to standard forensic accounting protocols. It wasn't a complete answer, but it was truthful enough to avoid perjury while focusing on the evidence rather than the methods. Mr. Kellerman, Judge Hawthorne said, regardless of how these documents were obtained, if they're authentic, they represent potential criminal activity. I'm going to allow them into evidence pending verification of their authenticity. You may cross-examine on that issue. Sarah handed me the next document. Can you explain what this financial summary represents? I looked at Dad as I answered, watching him realize that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling in real time. This document shows that my father transferred $2.3 million in marital assets to accounts and business entities that my mother was unaware of. These transfers occurred over an 18-month period and were disguised as legitimate business expenses and operational costs. Judge Hawthorne was making extensive notes now, her pen moving rapidly across the page. Behind me, I could hear whispered conversations in the gallery as observers began to understand the magnitude of what was being revealed. Ms. Daniels, in your professional opinion, do these transfers represent legitimate business activities? No, they do not. The timing, amounts, and categorizations are consistent with deliberate asset concealment in preparation for divorce proceedings. Several of the receiving accounts are held jointly with Ms. Candace Morris, who has no legitimate business relationship with my father's construction company. That's when Candace made her first mistake. She stood up abruptly, her face flushed with anger. This is insane. Daniel and I are business partners. We have every right to. Ma'am, sit down, Judge Hawthorne commanded. You are not a party to these proceedings, and you will not speak unless called as a witness. But the damage was done. Candace had just confirmed her business relationship with Dad in open court, validating our evidence about the hidden assets and joint accounts. Sarah smiled slightly as she handed me the final document. Ms. Daniels, can you identify this document? I held up the email printouts we'd found in Dad's files, the ones that detailed his timeline for leaving Mom with nothing while starting his new life with Candace. These are email communications between my father and Ms. Morris, discussing their plans to complete the asset transfer and begin their life together once my mother had been declared incompetent and placed under financial conservatorship. The courtroom erupted in whispered gasps. Judge Hawthorne banged her gavel once, restoring order, but her expression had shifted from professional interest to something much harder. Your Honor, Sarah said, we have 44 additional documents that detail every aspect of this conspiracy, including forged signatures, fraudulent medical evaluations, and hidden business entities created solely to conceal marital assets. Judge Hawthorne looked at Dad, who seemed to have aged 10 years in the past hour. Mr. Rothschild, do you understand that the evidence being presented suggests not just divorce fraud but potential criminal activity? Dad tried to speak, but no words came out. For the first time in my life, I was watching my father, the man who had controlled every conversation, every situation, every relationship he'd ever encountered, rendered completely speechless by the truth. And in that moment of silence, I knew that justice was finally going to have its day. Judge Hawthorne set down her pen and looked directly at Dad with the kind of expression that had made hardened criminals confess their crimes rather than face her cross-examination. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before she spoke. Mr. Rothschild, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I strongly advise you to consider your answer carefully. Are you claiming that these documents are fabricated? Dad's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Kellerman was frantically scribbling notes, probably calculating how quickly he could distance himself from what was clearly becoming a criminal case rather than a civil divorce proceeding. Your Honor, Dad finally managed, his voice hoarse, those documents, they're taken out of context. They're private notes about contingency planning for legitimate business purposes. Business purposes? Judge Hawthorne's eyebrows rose toward her hairline. Mr. Rothschild, one of these documents explicitly discusses having your wife declared mentally incompetent so you could control her assets permanently. Another details transferring the family home to yourself alone through what appears to be a forged signature. Exactly what business purpose does that serve? Those aren't. Helen has been struggling lately. I was trying to protect our family assets in case she made poor decisions. By removing her name from accounts she helped build? By hiding over $2 million in assets? By conspiring with a psychiatrist to create false medical records? Each question hit Dad like a physical blow. I watched 23 years of carefully constructed authority crumble as he realized that his own documentation had become evidence of his crimes. Judge Hawthorne turned to Kellerman. Counselor, I strongly suggest you advise your client about his Fifth Amendment rights, because this proceeding is about to take a very different direction. Kellerman whispered urgently in Dad's ear, but Dad seemed beyond listening. His gaze kept darting between the evidence on Sarah's table and the gallery where Candace sat frozen in her cream-colored silk, finally understanding that her comfortable future had just evaporated. Your Honor, Sarah said, standing, we have one additional piece of evidence that we believe clearly demonstrates the scope of this conspiracy. She handed me a document I hadn't seen before, something she'd kept in reserve for maximum impact. Miss Daniels, can you identify this document? I looked at the paper and felt my breath catch. It was a power of attorney form, signed by Mom but dated during the week she'd been visiting me in Phoenix. Another impossible signature, another piece of fraud so blatant it was almost insulting in its obviousness. This is a durable power of attorney that would have given my father complete control over my mother's financial and medical decisions. According to the notary's stamp, it was signed on October 15th, but my mother was in Phoenix visiting her sister that entire week. I have plane tickets, hotel receipts, and photographic evidence of her location during that time. Judge Hawthorne examined the document with growing incredulity. Mr. Rothschild, this signature was notarized on a date when your wife was demonstrably in another state. How do you explain this? Dad looked at the power of attorney like it was written in a foreign language. There must be some mistake with the dates. A mistake? Judge Hawthorne's voice carried the sharp edge of judicial authority pushed beyond its limits. Mr. Rothschild, this is the third document we've reviewed today with signature irregularities. At what point do mistakes become a pattern of fraud? That's when Kellerman made the smartest decision of his legal career. He stood and addressed the court with the careful tone of a man trying to save his own professional reputation. Your Honor, I move for an immediate recess. My client clearly needs time to consider his position, and I need to review these allegations more thoroughly before we proceed. Motion denied, Judge Hawthorne said flatly. Mr. Kellerman, your client filed these divorce proceedings claiming his wife was incompetent to manage her own affairs while simultaneously presenting fraudulent documents to steal those very assets he claimed she was incapable of protecting. We're going to resolve this matter today. She turned to the bailiff. Please contact the district attorney's office and inform them that I'll be referring this case for criminal investigation immediately following this hearing. The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations. Grandmother Delores looked like she was about to faint. Candace had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, probably calculating how quickly she could distance herself from Dad's sinking ship. But it was Mom's reaction that mattered most to me. For the first time in months, she sat up straight, her shoulders square, watching her husband face the consequences of his actions with an expression of quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with validation. Furthermore, Judge Hawthorne continued, I'm issuing an immediate temporary restraining order freezing all assets in Mr. Rothschild's name pending a complete forensic audit of the marital estate. Mr. Rothschild, you are prohibited from accessing any accounts, making any transfers, or disposing of any property until further order of this court. Dad's face went from white to gray. The careful financial maneuvering that had taken him 18 months to execute was being undone in 18 minutes. Mrs. Rothschild, Judge Hawthorne said, turning to Mom with a completely different tone, I'm granting you temporary exclusive use of the marital residence and access to sufficient funds from the frozen accounts to maintain normal household expenses. You will also have access to independent legal counsel to protect your interests in both the criminal investigation and the civil asset recovery proceedings. Sarah leaned over and whispered something to Mom, who nodded and stood slowly. Your Honor, Mom said, her voice clear and steady, I want to thank the court for listening to the truth. For the past 2 years, I was made to believe that I was losing my mind, that I couldn't be trusted with basic decisions about my own life. Today, I've learned that my confusion wasn't a sign of my incompetence, it was evidence of someone else's crimes. The simple dignity in her words was devastating. Here was a woman who had been systematically gaslit, financially abused, and nearly defrauded of everything she'd worked for, and instead of seeking vengeance, she was simply grateful for the opportunity to reclaim her sanity and her life. Judge Hawthorne's expression softened slightly. Mrs. Rothschild, the court recognizes that you have been the victim of an extensive campaign of financial and emotional abuse. This court will ensure that you receive every protection and remedy available under the law." She turned back to Dad, her voice resuming its sharp judicial edge. "Mr. Rothschild, you are ordered to vacate the marital residence within 24 hours. You may take only personal belongings, no documents, no electronics, no items of significant value. A court-appointed monitor will oversee the removal to ensure compliance." Dad tried one last time to salvage something from the wreckage. "Your Honor, surely we can work out some kind of arrangement. I've built that business from nothing. It employs 37 people." "Mr. Rothschild," Judge Hawthorne interrupted, "your business employs 37 people whose livelihoods you've potentially jeopardized by using company resources to fund personal fraud. The court-appointed receiver will ensure that legitimate business operations continue while we sort out what assets were legally acquired versus illegally concealed." The gavel came down with a sound like thunder. "This court is adjourned pending the completion of the forensic audit and the district attorney's investigation. Mr. Rothschild, I strongly suggest you retain criminal counsel immediately." As the courtroom began to empty, I watched Dad sit motionless at the plaintiff's table, staring at the evidence that had destroyed his carefully constructed empire. Candace had already fled, her cream silk dress disappearing through the courthouse doors as she ran from the wreckage of their shared delusions. Grandmother Delores approached our table slowly, her usual imperious confidence replaced by something that looked almost like shame. "Helen," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I believed Daniel's version of events without question. I should have known better." Mom looked at her former mother-in-law with the grace that had always defined her character. "We all believed what we wanted to believe, Delores. The important thing is that the truth finally came out." As we gathered our papers and prepared to leave, Sarah pulled me aside. "Rebecca, what you did today, the investigation, the documentation, the testimony, it was extraordinary work. Your mother is going to be financially secure for the rest of her life, and your father is going to face serious criminal consequences for his actions." I looked across the courtroom at Mom, who was speaking quietly with the victim's advocate the court had assigned to help her navigate the next phase of the proceedings. She looked smaller physically than she had before this ordeal began, but there was something else in her bearing now, a quiet strength that came from knowing she'd survived the worst kind of betrayal and emerged with her dignity intact. "It wasn't about the money," I told Sarah. "It was about making sure she knew she wasn't crazy." As we walked out of Montgomery County Courthouse into the bright afternoon sunshine, I realized that justice had many faces. Sometimes it looked like punishment for the guilty. Sometimes it looked like restitution for the victims. But sometimes, justice looked like a woman walking out of a courtroom with her head held high, finally free to remember who she'd been before someone tried to convince her she was nothing. And that was the kind of justice that would last long after the criminal trials ended and the asset recovery was complete. 6 months after that courthouse victory, I sat in Mom's kitchen, her kitchen now, officially and legally, watching her arrange fresh roses from the garden she'd reclaimed along with everything else. The morning sun streamed through windows she'd finally felt free to open wide, and the house felt different in ways that had nothing to do with the redecorating she'd been doing. The legal aftermath had unfolded exactly as Sarah Chen had predicted. Dad's criminal trial was scheduled for the fall, with charges including fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and elder abuse. The forensic audit had uncovered even more hidden assets than we'd originally found, bringing the total concealed amount to nearly $3 million. Candace Morris had been charged as a co-conspirator and was reportedly cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Dr. Franklin Pemberton had lost his medical license and was facing his own criminal charges for conspiracy and insurance fraud. It turned out Dad hadn't been his first victim. The good doctor had been running a lucrative side business creating fraudulent psychiatric evaluations for wealthy men who wanted to control their wives' finances. But more than the legal vindication, it was the personal transformation that meant everything. "Rebecca, look at this," Mom said, holding up a letter with the letterhead of Millbrook Community College. "They've accepted my application for the art therapy program. I start in the fall." At 62, Mom was going back to school, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. The woman who'd been convinced she was too confused to manage a checkbook was about to begin a master's degree program that would allow her to help other trauma survivors heal through creative expression. I'm so proud of you, I said, meaning every word. You know what's funny, she mused, settling into the chair across from me with her coffee. I spent so many years being afraid of making the wrong decision, afraid of disappointing Daniel, afraid of proving that I really was as incompetent as he said I was. Now I realized that the only wrong decision would have been continuing to let someone else make all my choices for me. The financial settlement had been substantial, as Sarah had promised. Beyond recovering the concealed assets, Mom had been awarded the house, half of Dad's legitimate business holdings, and significant spousal support. More importantly, she'd been awarded something that couldn't be quantified in dollar amounts, the knowledge that she was competent, intelligent, and fully capable of managing her own life. Have you heard from Grandmother Delores lately? I asked. Mom smiled, an expression that held no bitterness despite everything. She calls every Sunday. We're taking things slowly, but I think we're both learning to see each other as people rather than roles in Daniel's story. She's actually been very helpful with some of the legal paperwork. Turns out she has quite a head for financial details when she's not being manipulated by her son. The reconciliation with Grandmother Delores had been one of the unexpected outcomes of the whole ordeal. Faced with the undeniable evidence of her son's crimes, she'd been forced to confront her own role in enabling his behavior and dismissing his victims. The proud, judgmental woman I'd known all my life was slowly being replaced by someone more humble and self-aware. What about Dad? I asked carefully. It was always a delicate subject. Mom was quiet for a moment, sipping her coffee while she considered her words. He wrote me a letter last month. From his attorney's office, he's not allowed to contact me directly because of the restraining order. It was an apology, I think. Or his version of one. She pulled a folded paper from her purse and handed it to me. Dad's handwriting looked different somehow, less confident, more uncertain. Helen, it began, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, and I'm not writing this letter expecting anything from you. I just need you to know that somewhere along the way, I lost sight of the man I used to be and the woman you deserved to marry. I convinced myself that controlling everything meant protecting everyone, but I see now that what I was really protecting was my own fear of being ordinary, of not being important enough to hold on to the good things in my life. I'm facing the consequences of my choices now, and while I can't undo the damage I've done, I want you to know that your strength in standing up to me probably saved my life as much as it saved yours. I hope someday you can find peace, even if it doesn't include forgiveness for me. I folded the letter and handed it back to her. How do you feel about it? Sad, she said simply. Not angry anymore, just sad. Sad for the man he could have been, sad for the years we wasted, sad for the family we might have had if he'd been able to love without trying to control. Do you think you'll ever respond? Maybe someday. When I'm ready. My therapist says healing doesn't have a timeline, and forgiveness is something I'll do for myself, not for him. Right now, I'm focused on building the life I want rather than processing the life I left behind. That afternoon, we drove to the cemetery where Mom's parents were buried. She'd started visiting them regularly again, another small freedom she'd reclaimed. Dad had always found reasons why cemetery visits were unnecessary, wasteful, morbid. Now she could grieve and remember on her own terms. I think they would have been proud of how you handled everything, I said as we stood before their shared headstone. I hope so. They taught me to be strong, but somewhere along the way I forgot that strength doesn't mean enduring abuse, it means refusing to accept it. On the drive home, we passed the construction site where Dad's company was building a new office complex under court-appointed management. The business would survive, Sarah had made sure of that, protecting the jobs of innocent employees while ensuring that Dad could never again use it as a vehicle for fraud. Do you ever regret not trying to work things out? I asked as we pulled into her driveway. Mom considered the question seriously, the way she now approached most things, with careful thought rather than anxious second-guessing. You know, for a while I thought I should feel guilty about destroying his life. But then I realized I didn't destroy anything, I just stopped participating in the destruction of my own life. Daniel made his choices over many years, choice after choice after choice. I just finally made some choices of my own. That evening, as I prepared to leave from my own apartment, Mom handed me a small wrapped package. "What's this for?" "Open it." Inside was a silver compass, engraved with words that made my throat tight, from my daughter, who helped me find my way home to myself. "Mom, I know you think you were just doing what anyone would do, but that's not true. What you did required courage, skill, and a kind of love that was willing to risk everything to save someone who had almost given up on saving herself. I will never be able to thank you enough for giving me my life back." I hugged her in the doorway of the house she'd almost lost, breathing in the scent of the roses she'd almost stopped tending, feeling the strength in arms that had almost forgotten their own power. As I drove home through the tree-lined streets of Millbrook Heights, I thought about the nature of justice and family and the complicated mathematics of love. Sometimes protecting the people you care about means standing up to the people you're supposed to respect. Sometimes love looks like saying no. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to keep someone else's secrets when those secrets are destroying innocent lives. Dad would serve his time and face his consequences. Candace would rebuild her life away from the wreckage of her choices. Grandmother Delores would continue learning to see the world through more honest eyes. And Mom would continue growing into the person she'd always been underneath the fear and manipulation, strong, intelligent, capable, and free. The compass she'd given me sat on my dashboard, its needle pointing steadily north no matter which direction I turned. Some things, I realized, stay constant even when everything else changes. Truth. Justice. The love that refuses to let go even when letting go would be easier. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, those constant things are enough to guide you home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.